Good morning. We're so glad you guys are here with us today. You're either online or on our Facebook page, and we're excited that you chose to join us this morning. If you would like to connect with us, leave a comment below or hit the comment button on the online platform, and somebody will be there to speak with you. If you would like prayer, there's a button on the online platform for prayer, or our Facebook host will put that in the link for you today. So again, we're so glad you guys are here with us today. So let's just go ahead and dive in.
Well, hey, thanks for joining us. I know we've been having a ton of fun with this series because I think it's one of those conversations as we walk through our series, Formed by the Spirit. It's one of those conversations that really asks and begs a lot of questions. What is too spiritual? What is not spiritual enough? What is the role of the Spirit in all of this? And we've been walking through the conversation. Specifically, we've been in 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, chapter 12 last week. And we really wanted to lay a foundation. And so what we did is we said, okay, if we're going to talk about spiritual gifts, we need to define the terms. We need to say what spiritual gifts are as we understand them based on what Paul said. And so if you missed last week, I'm going to give you a quick recap. Go back and watch the actual sermon. But here's the quick thing we really needed you to understand last week, and it's the definition of spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts are God's grace through you for others. God's grace through you for others. And so, man, we really need to understand this, because if we start to think that these spiritual gifts are of our own volition, our own effort, our own ability or inability, we don't have them because we don't do what we need to do, then we're going to miss the mark, right? And so understanding that these gifts are not based on your effort or your own volition is huge in the conversation. Understanding that God gives them to you in a moment when you need them is massive. It changes the whole conversation. It changes just how important these things are and where they come from. And then the other thing on the other side of that we need you to understand is that it's always going to be for others. And so when you experience a spiritual gift, when you step into one of those, it's always going to be for the sake of somebody else. And so they're God's grace through you. God graciously gives it to you in a moment for somebody else. And so such an important foundation, especially as we start to dive in to this week's conversation, because in this week's conversation, what Paul's going to talk to us about is the fact that unity does not equal uniformity, and that unity is way more important than uniformity, and the grace side of this conversation makes a massive difference. But before he gets into this, what he's going to talk to us about is the body, and he's going to talk about how the body can't function properly unless all of its members are working together and pulling in one direction for one accord. And I think about this, and I think of the words he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and I think about my own life. Because when I was in high school, got into a car accident, and on the backside of that car accident, there were some injuries that I didn't particularly know about. And as a pitcher in baseball, my arm felt fine coming out of the car accident. But on the backside of that, I realized, man, I got some back pain. And as I was going through physical therapy and I was doing all this stuff, I remember one day the physical therapist looking at me and said, okay, if we're going to fix your lower back, what we need to do is we need to work on your hamstrings. And I was thinking to myself, my hamstrings, what do my hamstrings have to do with my lower back? And he's explaining to me, and he's explaining how those muscles come up and they cross into your lower back. And so a lot of times the tight hamstrings will equal a bad lower back. And so one of the things that I had to do was stretch. And I thought it was the most boring, lame way that we were going to fix this thing. I thought there's no way it's going to work. And lo and behold, he gave me this tool to stretch with. And every day I would see progress get made, and I would stretch a little further and my hamstrings would get a little bit looser. And there it is, my lower back would have pain alleviated. And I just remember thinking to myself that it didn't make sense until I understood how the body worked. It didn't make sense until I understood that my legs were attached to my lower back, and that if I wanted to work in unison, I was going to have to get my lower back better before I could get my arm better, because I was compromising things along the way as I tried to be an athlete, as I tried to play baseball. And so I think Paul has a very similar picture in mind, and we're going to dive into that today. We're going to dive into this conversation on the backside of last week that he has. And I love this because he starts this conversation with the word for. And so what he's going to do is he's going to say for, and what he means to do is point back at everything he just said. So, okay, here's how I'm going to explain everything I just talked to you about in verses 1 through 11. And so if you have your Bible and you're reading along at home, in the car, whenever, be careful in the car if you're reading the car. If you're following along with us, that's where we're going to be, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're going to pick up in verse 12. And this is how Paul gets the conversation going. He says, for just as the body is one and has many parts, and all the parts of that body, though many, are one body, so also is Christ. I love this, because here comes Paul. He says, okay, so here's what I need you to know about the fact that spiritual gifts are God's grace through you for others. I need you to know what your role is in that. And so just as the body is one and has many parts, you have one body, but you have thumbs, you have fingers, you have wrists, you have elbows, you have knees, you have legs, you have arms, you have ears, you have eyes. You have all these different parts of the body, but it's still one body. And then all of the parts of that body, though there's many of them, they're just one body. So also is Christ. And so he starts to lay the foundation. He's saying, here's how we work. Here's how we operate as the body. Here's how we operate as people who are stepping into relationship with Jesus. This is what it should look like when you realize Christ is in control of this whole thing. The Spirit is what unifies you. And he starts to tell them, like, man, we need all of this together. We can't just have bits of it, and we can't just have pieces of it. We need everything to work in unison. And I love this because part of the contextual piece of this conversation is probably the fact that he can see the Asclepian artifacts that are scattered all throughout. And they did some excavation on this site, and they would see when they dug up these terracottas, these clay pieces, they would see the sacrifices that people would make. And so people would shape a foot, and then they would sacrifice a foot to hope that God would give them some kind of healing with that area. And so they would make these clay pieces, and they would scatter them about. And you imagine what Paul has in his mind is this picture of all of these body parts just kind of laid about and thrown about on this site and this temple, right? And what he's thinking and what he's understanding is he's writing this to the church in Corinth. He's saying, hey, here's the problem. When we operate on our own, this is what it looks like. It looks like a bunch of random body parts that are useless. They're dead, decrepit, and we can't do what we need to do. We're not going to accomplish what we need to accomplish as the body. It looks a lot more like random parts just kind of thrown everywhere than it does all of those pieces coming together and functioning properly. And so Paul gets this picture, and they have this picture, and he paints this picture. He says, this is what we don't want it to look like. We don't want it to look like the eyes operate on their own, the ears operate on their own. We want everybody to understand that they're working together and that they have a unique gift that they bring to the table. And we talked about this a little bit, but we said we don't want to understand or mistake the understanding that unity equals uniformity. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when we talk about unity with the body, here's what unity looks like. In this example, it looks like all the people with different spiritual gifts working together. And so if you have the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues, it looks like you working together with the person who's got the spiritual gift of healing, and it looks like you working together with the person who has got the spiritual gift of discerning in that moment. So all these things are working together for the sake of who? Somebody else. To reach them, to edify them, to build them up, to share the gospel with them. And he's saying, I don't want you to mistake unity with uniformity, because we need all of these different pieces. You can't just have a couple of these different pieces. If you do, what it's going to look like is uniformity, not unity. And if it's uniformity, it looks like you got a bunch of ears, and everybody has to look like an ear, and everybody has to do what an ear does, or everybody has to look like an arm, and everybody has to look like they can do what an arm does. Imagine that. Imagine you had a full-grown, body-sized arm, and they couldn't hear anything, they couldn't see anything, they couldn't taste anything, they couldn't do anything other than what an arm does. And so if it's uniformity that the church is after, Paul's saying you're going to be limited in scope. It's not about uniformity. It's not about that everybody has to do the same things. In fact, if it's God's grace, then he gave you a specific gift for the moment, and you don't have to do what everybody else does. In fact, they need your gift to step into this. If it's unity, you understand this, and you say, oh, okay, I understand the legs and the arms are supposed to work together. And the eyes are supposed to tell us where we're going, and the ears are supposed to hear, and the mind's supposed to discern, and all these different things. But if we mistake unity and uniformity, we're going to miss it, because we're going to think that, no, everybody has to have this spiritual gift. Everybody has to be this part of the body. And Paul's saying, no. I'm not after uniformity. God's not after uniformity. God is after unity. Unity can be there without uniformity. And so he keeps the conversation going in verse 13. He says, for we were all baptized by one Spirit into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all given one Spirit to drink. I love this. And Paul says, okay, here, I'm going to show you just what I mean by the fact that you should be unified. I'm going to double down on this, and I'm going to show you that you should be unified because God is not divided. And the same Spirit that lives in you, the foot, should live in you, the arm. The same Spirit that lives in you, the healer, should live in you, the discerner. And so it should be an understanding that we all operate by the same Spirit. And so he reminds them. He says, if we were all baptized by one Spirit into one body, then we were all given one Spirit to drink. And we should be unified, not because of what we're able to do, but because of who we do it by and from. And if it's a gift from the Spirit through you for others, then Paul's got the understanding, man, it's about the Spirit giving you a gift. The Spirit is this thing that unifies you. And the beauty of this is he's writing to this church, and what they understand at this point is that if you have been saved, you are part of the body. In Ephesians, it says the Spirit is the down payment for the believer. And so if you have believed, if you believed in Jesus, if you have surrendered to Jesus, then you have the Spirit inside of you. And so he's trying to tell all these Christians that come from different backgrounds, hey, here's the deal. It doesn't matter how divided you were or think you currently are. If you have the Spirit, if you've been saved and been given the Spirit, then you are part of the body, and you've got a role to play in the body. And I love it because he just got done talking about all this in verses 4 through 11. It says, here's why this matters. Last week, go back and look. Here's why this matters, and here's what the Spirit does. The Spirit distinguishes the believer from the non-believer. It's a mark of the believer. It's the thing that says, yes, I've been saved by grace. The Spirit speaks to that. He's been given to me because of that. And the Spirit is what it especially marks the beginning of Christian life, right? This is how I know I've been saved. This is how I know what I'm stepping into. Paul talks about that in Galatians chapter 3. So this is the marker that you have, but it doesn't only mark the beginning of the believer's life. It's also what makes a person a child of God. He talks about that in another letter in Romans chapter 8. It says, here's what the Spirit does. It lets you know you're saved. It lets you know you're adopted. It lets you know you're valued. And so if all those things are true, we don't have to fight. We can be unified because you have the same Spirit that they have, despite having completely different gifts from the Spirit. You've just got to understand that it's God giving you guys these different things so that we can pull in the same direction, not a different direction. And if I wanted to, I would get on my soapbox right now and I would talk about how we've just missed it in the American church because we've made it a matter of gifts and a matter of uniformity and not a matter of unity, and we've just not understood fully the fact that God has given us different gifts. Nobody else, God has given them to us, but it's by the same exact Spirit that saves you and that saves me that we have these gifts. And so instead of being a divided church in America, we should be one of the most unified churches in America. We should understand this, but we miss it because I think we put way more emphasis on uniformity than we do on unity. But Paul keeps writing. He wants to keep making this point clear, and he gets to verse 14. And he says, indeed, the body is not one part, but many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it is not for that reason or any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it is not for that reason any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God has arranged each one of the parts in the body just as he wanted. And if they were all the same part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. Or again, the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that are weaker and indispensable, as in those parts of the body that we consider less honorable, we clothe these with greater honor, and our unrespectable parts are treated with greater respect, which our respectable parts do not need. I love this. He's getting here and he's saying, hey, the whole point is that all of these gifts have to function together. And the point within the point is that God has graciously given you the gifts in the first place. And so we don't look down on certain gifts. We celebrate both the biggest end of the spectrum and the smallest end of the spectrum when it comes to gifts. And by the way, as you keep reading, the things that you think are on the upper end of that spectrum might end up being on the lower end of that spectrum. And so I think as we keep this conversation going in the coming weeks, it's so important to understand what's valuable to God may not seem as valuable to us and vice versa, yet since it's all a gift from God and you wouldn't have it without God, he's saying, here's the deal, I need you to understand that they're all valuable and we're going to treat every gift with respect. And so here's the thing, if we are a part of the body and God has dubbed you the foot or the hand or whatever spiritual gift you have, I don't know, but if you are a part of the body, here's the reality for that. It means the other parts need you. It means the body's not going to function properly or fully or at max capacity until you step in to the gifts that God has given you. And so the conversation goes both ways. It goes to the side of the coin that says, hey, whoa, we don't want to be arrogant about our gifts. But it goes to the other side of the coin, and the other end of the spectrum, and says, hey, I don't want you to just sit there idly with your gifts. Because if I'm the eyes, I can't go. I can see the need, but I can't go there without the feet. So I need you to step into this, brother. I need you to step into this, sister, because we got to go. We have a mission that needs to be fulfilled. And so we've got to understand that if we are a part of the body, we have an obligation. The other parts of the body need us. And if we are a part of the body, we shouldn't be looking down on any other parts of the body because we need them. You can be the best set of eyes anyone's ever had. And unless you have the feet to get you there, those eyes are going to sit there and they're going to see a problem but never solve a problem. They're going to see lostness but never step into lostness. So it works on both sides of the coins. We need the other believers and the other believers need us. We've got to function together in unison. And this is why it's so important to look at Jesus, to listen to Jesus, and to give Jesus a yes. And to quit taking up our time and our energy with fights and issues and concerns and start just giving Jesus a yes and understanding that impacting lostness out there is going to change people's eternity, and that's far greater than us wrestling over these small theological issues and getting them wrong and deciding who's the greater and who's the lesser. And so we've got to get this right because the body depends on it, and God's got a calling for us to live on mission, but it's going to start with us figuring out how to work in unison. I would love to see this firsthand if we could just take 25, 50 believers and say, all right, guys, go on the mission field and see what God gives you in that moment and work together and start impacting lostness. I think it would be incredible. But Paul keeps the conversation going, and we got to get through this a little bit quicker. But he says this in verse 24. Instead, God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the less honorable, so that there would be no division in the body, but that the members would have the same concern for each other. So if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. He's basically doubling down and saying, I need you to understand it's from God. If you don't get that, you're going to have a hard time honoring others. If they don't get that, they're going to have a hard time honoring you. You got to understand it's grace and it's a gift to you. It's grace, and so we can honor the ones that seem less honorable. It's grace so they can honor the ones that seem more honorable. It could be an equal level of grace because it was a gift that was given to you in the first place. And I love this quote from Brian Peterson. I want to read it to you real quick. Since the church is intended to be a foretaste of the final reconciliation of all the things that God has promised, Paul calls the church to start acting that way, start acting like a foretaste. Thus, diversity within the church is not a problem to be avoided, solved, or managed, but a gift of God's grace and a sign of the Spirit at work. A gift of God's grace and a sign of the Spirit at work. That's what diversity speaks to. The differing gifts of the Spirit form us in such a way that we do and indeed must belong to one another. So if we're going to really show God's grace to the world, if we're really going to understand God's grace, then we're really going to understand that there's going to be diversity within the body, that there's going to be different gifts, there's going to be different people who can meet different needs, and there's going to be different callings, and all these things together are going to be the vehicle, the mission that impacts the world. But we've got to understand it. We've got to move past mine is better than yours. We've got to move past it could be different, and that's okay. And we've got to step into the calling that God has and understand, man, it's grace. And God decided to give them that measure of grace and you this measure of grace. And it was because he's good, he knows what's better for the kingdom, and he wants you to step into that so that we can impact lostness. And so, man, If we are a part of the body, here's what it looks like. It looks like when parts of the body hurt, it hurts us. If this is grace, and this is us working together, it looks like what hurts one member of the body hurts us. If I go and I stub my toe, and it hurts a lot, I can say, my toe hurts. But what I would understand if I tried to go run a marathon is that not only does my toe hurt, but now my body hurts. Because my body's not able to do, the legs aren't able to do what they're supposed to do because of the weight I can't put on my toe. And so you start to understand this is not just an individual thing. This is how the body functions together. And so if we are a part of the body, what hurts the body hurts us. And if we are a part of the body, in the same token, what helps the body helps us. And so if this is true, we should be looking out for each other and we should be helping each other out. We should be trying to avoid hurt and strife, and we should be trying to lean into healing and uplifting and edifying. This is what it should look like, because this is not something that happens on an island. We don't silo our ministries. We don't silo our gifts. They function together, and if they function together, we understand the repercussions for one are the repercussions for the whole. And we don't want to get to the point where we start to value certain pieces of what the Spirit offers. We want to value the whole Spirit, because He's the one that gives these gifts. He's the one that secures you. He's the one that changes you, and He's the one that gives these gifts to you. And I love that. I love that that's how it works. I love that that's how we operate. And I want to read you one more quote in regard to that part of the conversation, but here it is now. There's a big difference between the gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit. This is the beginning of that quote. And the reason I want to read you this quote is because here's what we have a tendency to do. We have a tendency to say, man, the biggest emphasis I should be putting on my life is what happens with my gifts and whether or not I have these gifts and what I can do with these gifts. And I just don't think that's true. I think the biggest thing that we should be focused on in the life of the believer is not the gifts that we have from the Spirit, but the fruit that gets produced from the Spirit. Because the fruit that gets cultivated in us is not the same as the gifts. But I would argue it's probably more important than the gifts, because it changes the way that you treat people. It changes the way that you respond to problems. It changes the way that you have a desire to even step into impacting lostness with your gifts. And so I don't want you to get it confused. We're having the conversation about spiritual gifts, but I want you to know, as we have the conversation about spiritual gifts, there's something that may be even more important from the Spirit, and that's how the fruit of the Spirit gets cultivated in your life. And so I'm going to finish this quote from Ray Stedman, but I wanted you to hear that. The big difference between the gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit is massive. The fruit is what God is after. That is the character of Christ coming through. The gifts are given to enable us to achieve an increasing degree by mutual exercise, the fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit is what God is after. And every congregation should be infinitely more concerned with the fruit of the Spirit than they are with the gifts of the Spirit. And here's what I think will happen. I truly believe this. If we start to understand, step into, lean into, ask God to change us with the fruit of the Spirit, we're going to desire an impact for lostness. We're going to desire to step into seeing our neighbor saved. We're going to desire to edify and build up the church. And when we start to desire those things, we're going to live on mission. And I think we're going to see some of these gifts start to come out, because you don't go and you don't live on mission without trusting Jesus. If you truly live on mission and you truly trust Jesus and you truly let the Spirit work, it's like Peter says, He's going to give you the gifts, the words you need in a moment, and that's what you're going to impact lostness with. And so we have to understand it. We have to go, but we have to understand that a lot of these issues we struggle with, they start right here. And they start because we have not asked God to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit within us. And we've been more concerned with step 3, 4, and 5 and what those gifts from the Spirit look like. But I want to say today, as we start to understand grace in the gifts, we probably need to start asking God for a little bit more of the fruit that would lead us to step into moments where we would exercise the gifts of the Spirit. Because we are the church, but none of us can be the church on our own. We are the church. You are the one that needs cultivating. You are the one that needs the fruit of the Spirit. You are the one that needs to step into calling, but so does your brother and your sister. So does your neighbor. And when we get this, we understand, okay, I can do this, but if the arm is the only person that ever steps into the fruit of the Spirit, we're going to miss it. But if the arm and the legs and the eyes and the ears and the nose, if we all get this together, now we have an engine. Now we have a means by which we can go and we can be the church collectively, because you are the church, but you cannot be the church fully on your own. We need the other pieces of the body, these other gifts to step into it with us. So I want to invite you this morning to do one thing specifically. If there's a response for you in your living room, in your car, wherever you're watching or listening this morning, here's what I want to invite you to do. I want to invite you to ask God this morning, this afternoon, wherever, whenever, to start to cultivate in you the fruit of the Spirit so that you would have a passion for the lostness around you, and He would start to use the gifts of the Spirit as you do that. Let me pray for you. God, thank you for today. Thank you for clarifying this through the words of Paul, because it's so easy for us to get selfish. It's so easy for us to have a pecking order established in our mind. I think of the disciples who sit there and ask, who is the greatest among us? And they argue over that. God, I don't want to be a church that argues who the greatest disciples are. I want to be a church that is led by your Spirit, is cultivated by your Spirit, so we have the fruit of the Spirit, and then is given gifts by your Spirit because we're living on mission. So God, I pray that you would do that, and I pray that we would look at the orchard and the timeline of history, and we would see an impact for lostness because we understood these pieces correctly. We love you. We praise you. We're asking these things in your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, so great word from AJ there. We are the church, but we cannot be the church on our own. Or in other words, unity does not equal uniformity. I think that was super challenging for all of us who are listening, for all of you guys who are listening. And just want to remind you guys that while we love our online platform, unity comes from being together in community. And so we would love to encourage you guys to come and join us at one of our locations, whether that's Lake City, Live Oak, or Brantford. Or if you just aren't able to make it, we'll see you guys next week online. Thanks for tuning in today.